All right, now to pick up where we left off in the last one, fascism as a political ideology, unlike communism, which has a big theory with different stages, and it's got a big theorist like Marx and Engels, fascism doesn't have a big framework to it or systematic nature. It's very much a political system that's about picking and choosing things based on what you need it to be. It always likes tradition. So like in Italy, Mussolini will partner with the Catholic Church under what's called the Lateran Agreement, where it gives the Catholic Church control over Vatican City in 1929. But it's not like Mussolini himself is a great believer in tradition. He just uses tradition because that's what fits his idea of the worldview. Similarly, fascists always push for modernization of the military and industry and technology. At the same time, though, they don't push for any of the democratic values that come along with increasing technology, where you can share different thoughts or different views. It's all for the purpose of the strong leader and the strong national government. That's the Lateran Agreement being signed there. Fascism also loves slogans because slogans give the sense of action and doing things without actually making large-scale changes to help individual workers, like bring order, restore Italy, return to greatness, Italy for Italians, defend Italy, do your duty to the state, all that kind of stuff. But there isn't a clear policy to go along with it. What matters always in fascism is power of the state and the cult of personality around the trusted leader. In the case of Italy, it's Mussolini. In the case of Germany, it's Adolf Hitler. And the idea that that person alone can fix the problems. That's all fascist stuff. They use generalizations as well of an in-group and an out-group that serves the state. So the in-group is people who benefit the government, and the out-group is people who don't benefit the government. It is also inherently a racist ideology that has an in and out group, right? And the fun thing about it that this professor points out, and same as George Massey, is that it's eclectic in its evidence but not vague in its purpose. Its purpose is to make a scapegoat. But it doesn't matter exactly if evidence doesn't fit with it or does. Fascists will always sort of move evidence around to make that in and out group. So, for example, if the best works of German literature are done by Jews, they'll just say that those happen to be people who actually weren't Jewish, or that they didn't look Jewish, and so therefore they're not Jewish. So they find ways around it to basically justify their particular position. Also, fascists love propaganda. They like to portray the person as like a tough man who takes no bunk, a man's man, but also a wise person. So like one of the famous things that Mussolini has is that he fought a lion, was a baby, or that he got to run the trains on time, which wasn't true, but it showed his idea that he could bring stability and order. Now, Umberto Eco is a philosopher who wrote down a series of 14 ways to spot fascism. We're going to actually look at more of them in a discussion post, but for right now, he brought up the idea of the cult of traditionalism that fascists love to talk about, this idealized past of a perfect time and trying to return to that perfect time, but never too specific, because if it gets too specific, then there's ways that people can debate it and disagree. They reject modernism, like changes to art or culture, although they accept modernism in terms of technology. They reject the idea of disagreement and diversity because that is like a threat and a weakness. There's only one good version of what it means to be a man, or means to be an Italian, or means to be a German. Only one good version of what it means to be a woman. Fascists always love to talk about the struggle and how great the struggle is. Fascists also love to use actions for action's sake. So like fascist governments will oftentimes launch into plans without any real reason for doing them, like solving a hunger crisis that doesn't exist, or producing more goods that you don't need, because it shows action to people without needing to actually do anything. And the last thing they love to do is to like celebrate sacrifice to the country without actually caring about the person. So like the person died for the country is a huge fascist thing. What sort of things you saw in the early parts of the first video with World War I remembrance, like the Cult of the Dead, play into fascist ideology is something I'd like you to think about. Switching over to the other one, fascism in Germany has its roots in 1920s Germany. Now, Germany, after the Kaiser abdicates, becomes run by a democratic government called the Weimar Republic. But it's new, it's massively in debt, and it's lost territory to France. That isn't great. It also eventually has massive inflation where 4 trillion marks will be worth as much as a single dollar. Now, they try to solve that through a couple of plans from the U.S. government called the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan, but it's still bad. And there is a sense that Germany feels isolated from the rest of the world and that there is no help in all of dealing with this debt and everything else issues. And it's in that feeling of being isolated and left out and abandoned by the economy of the world and treated poorly that fascism is able to arise in Germany. Through the little corporal, dear old Hitler. He's a big fan of Mussolini. He is a veteran of World War I, kind of like Mussolini, and he's also a spy for the government. He's supposed to spy on the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, which is where it's the Nazis, Nationalistische Sozialistische, National Socialist. He eventually ends up joining them. Keep in mind that National Socialism is not socialism. It's not about democracy or about increasing the effect for workers. It's about this idea of a strong national state. And by that way, again, it's national. It's the national government. Socialism, it's by and for the government's benefit. They have a paramilitary group like the Italians called the Brown Shirts, and he uses, again, this idea of the singular leader by calling himself Der Führer, the leader, just like Mussolini called himself Il Duce. He hits very hard on blaming the Treaty of Versailles. He's heavily supported by men. 70% of them are under 40. He constantly talks about how democracy and socialism has made people weak, that it's all about being tough, sort of standing on your own, lauding that kind of the soldier idea, etc. He is a little bit firmer than Mussolini is on like racial superiority and anti-Semitism, which is like anti-Jewish stuff, than Mussolini is, but still very similar. He tries to actually copy Mussolini in 1923 by launching his own March on Rome. It's called the Beer Hall Putsch. Putsch is like is an overthrow in German. It's at Munich, but he gets caught, and he should be executed for treason for trying to overthrow the government. But he basically goes before the court, and like Ulrich Zwingli or Martin Luther before him, when the court says, you're guilty of treason, he basically says, I'm guilty of treason? You're guilty of treason for not loving Germany enough. And the judges are persuaded that he is a true patriot, and they just give him a short sentence in prison. He has a realization in prison that he can't destroy the Weimar Republic, this democratic government, from without. He has to destroy it from within, and he starts to use propaganda and politics to win elections. And he oftentimes uses this image of him as this not normal politician who's from outside the system. He's not corrupted, he always says, even though he very much was corrupt to a certain level, and that he's the solution to everyone's problems, even though he doesn't have like large-scale plans about anything. It's basically just him saying he can figure it out. He will use the media oftentimes to portray himself and the Brown Shirts, that paramilitary group, as these upstanding young German men, good German men, racially pure German men who are quick acting, even though most of them were unemployed thugs, dropout college kids, all that kind of stuff. At the same time, they portray the government as slow, communistic, immoral, ineffective, and uses that mass media image of him for support. And the marches and his speeches are all very dynamic, and so the media follows him, and the media just gives him more airtime. The Great Depression gives that sense of desperation, and in 1932 he wins 37.8% of the vote for the Reichstag, which is like their version of Congress. Again, uses classic imagery of tradition, like soldiers of old in the Middle Ages defeating communism and Judaism as a dragon, even though he himself, as Hitler said, was an atheist. Didn't care about Christianity at all, wasn't a Christian practicer. The imagery of tradition is more important than tradition itself. This idea that there's an in and an out group, a good old way and a bad new way. Again, also here we go. Hitler as this kind of, again, messianic, that's like Christ-like savior, warrior savior. The important thing to know about him, though, is that like in 1932 when he wins that majority, the Social Democrats win 21%, the Communists win 14%, and there's a bunch of other liberal, left-leaning, less conservative, more democratic parties. These more democratic parties win the majority. So realistically, if they all were to bind together, they can make what's called a coalition government. Okay? That is liberal and democratic. But it all falls apart because of what's called the Chancellor deal. Now, the president at the time of Germany is a sort of symbolic figure who's also the head of the military. His name is President Hindenburg. Hindenburg hates Hitler, calls him a ridiculous Austrian corporal. And he wants to nominate his friend Kurt Schleicher to be chancellor, which is like prime minister. But Franz von Papen sees an opportunity to use Nazi popularity to his benefit. And he argues that the Nazis should be kind of partnered with the Conservative Party of Germany, and that the Nazis and the Conservatives will make a coalition government. Franz von Papen, who's been out because Kurt Schleicher's been in charge, he'll become vice chancellor. Hitler will become chancellor. They'll combine those two. It'll be a very popular government. They can get things done. And that Franz von Papen, because he's the vice chancellor, though, he'll be able to control Hitler and his radicalness with advisors. So he'll be a powerless figurehead is the idea. And that all the people around him will manage him and make it totally fine is the idea. Here is the kind of chancellor agreement. That's Hindenburg in the suit. That's Hitler over here. These are sad ghost children right down below. In 1932, let's check on the video time. All right, we're going to do one last video here just to make sure we're all